Hundreds of folks have showed up and created and cultivated community with us. And so thank you to everybody again for spending time with us today. We are about to dive into a conversation with our Department of the Interior Secretary Deb Halaand here in just a couple of moments. That town in DC is doing a lot of work, and so schedules are a little bit fluctuating at the moment, but we're going to go ahead and get started. But before I do, I have a question for the chat. I actually have two questions for the chat. One of them is, would you live in the Arctic or the Sahara Desert? That's a big one. I don't know. I'm a desert rat myself, so I like to come. I'd pick the Sahara. And then I would also say, what do you like to save your food in? Do you go for the empty buckets of manteca like my abuela, or do you guys go buy some Tupperware? So for me, it's always the manteca buckets. I've got like 5 of them in the fridge right now. Awesome. But guys, I'm going to go ahead and just get us started. That way, when the secretary joins us, we are able to dive right into the good stuff. And Madam Secretary has just joined us now. So I will just dive in. Madam Secretary, thank you so much for joining us today. So good to see you once again. It was great to see you out at Chaco Canyon, and excited to dive in with you again. Public lands and waters are often seen as a defining feature of our nation's shared heritage and character. However, throughout our history, racism, exclusion, oppression, and injustices have traditionally shaped the operations and policies of land management agencies and created barriers to access and public participation. And it is with a humble heart and mucho orgullo to introduce our Secretary of the Interior, Madam Deb Halaand. The momentum, the power, the acknowledgement that you have started us off with, we are just so excited to continue this momentum. So Ms. Deb Halaand, you put us to work, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, there we go. After all this time, after all this time, right? But thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's always great to see a fellow Southwesterner at these national events, especially someone who is so familiar with my home state. The work you're doing with Nuestra Tierra in New Mexico helps families reconnect with our public lands in our area and inspires all of us to strive to do more. Good afternoon, buenos tardes, everyone. I'm honored to join Green Latinos Winter National Summit from the ancestral homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway people right here in Washington, D.C. I want to start my remarks by first saying thank you. Thank you to Green Latinos for the work you've done over the years to promote environmental justice and ring the alarm about climate change. Tomorrow marks 1 year since the Biden-Harris administration came in, facing the interlocking challenges of this public health emergency, the climate crisis, economic uncertainty, and a history of racial injustice. We knew these challenges would not be solved overnight. In fact, we knew these challenges would not be solved in a year. But that didn't stop us from taking bold steps to address the stark challenges that families across our country face. I know that I don't have to tell anyone at this summit that climate change impacts communities of color and poor communities disproportionately. You also know that those disparities didn't just happen overnight. It's been a long history of environmental injustice, lack of access to clean water, pollution in the air, and basic infrastructure failures that fed into those disparities. We're at a critical moment in our efforts to address the climate crisis. You know what I'm talking about. The bright orange skies and wildfire flames across the West, destructive storms hitting our coasts, and devastating tornadoes in the Midwest. Each of these catastrophic events impacts families, elders, and neighbors, not only directly by the disaster, but also by the smoke, poor air quality, power outages, and coastal erosion that result. Climate change and the disasters that come from them have no boundaries. Every community faces the pain and heartache that those events bring. However, not every community has the resources to rebuild or even relocate when a climate event happens in their backyard. That's why the Biden-Harris administration is building equity and inclusion into our all-of-government approach to the climate crisis. The Department of the Interior is playing a critical role in implementing the president's ambitious climate change goals. We're rooting our work in equity as we address the barriers to access to the outdoors and how we can close those gaps, create a clean energy economy, and address the legacy of environmental injustice. I truly believe that our nation's public lands belong to all of us. However, many communities, particularly in urban areas, communities of color, and poor communities, they don't have access to the outdoors, not the way a lot of people do. On top of that, climate change is threatening many of the natural places that we all love. It makes me so sad to hear about young kids who have never been to a vast outdoor space, or families who don't have the means to make memories at our parks. My love for the outdoors came from my dad. He was an active duty Marine during my childhood. And though we moved around a lot when I was young, he always took me and my siblings outside, no matter where we lived. I remember as a child walking for hours on beaches, climbing mountains, lacing up my sneakers and walking in cold rivers, and just enjoying the outdoors. I saw the same joy during a visit to the San Diego Wildlife Refuge late last year. I met with a group of kids who were learning about wildlife and ecosystems in the place that they call home. They could feel the dirt in their hands, smell the desert plants, and see water soak into the earth. As they grow up and live their lives, they'll remember that experience, and it will help them to always care about that place. Those kids will be more likely to be responsible stewards of the land because they've had those opportunities to experience it. Maybe we'll see them become park rangers or land managers or wildlife scientists at Interior one day. But look, it's our job to make sure all kids have that opportunity. On top of that, it's well documented that access to the outdoors is good for our health. And I'd even go farther to say that nature is also good for our souls. Every community deserves access to those benefits. And that's why equity is a huge part of President Biden's bold conservation initiative called America the Beautiful. It's a 10-year locally led effort to conserve and restore the lands and waters that bind us together as Americans. Through it, the president set the first ever national goal to restore and conserve 30% of US lands and ocean by 2030, a goal that I know Green Latinos embraced when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change announced the recommendation. America the Beautiful, at its core, is a call to action for all of us to do more for the planet, for the economy, and for future generations. It's a vision that recognizes that nature offers some of the most cost-effective ways to address the climate crisis, that we need to do more to stem the steep loss of nature and wildlife, and that we need to address the inequitable access to the outdoors for communities of color. This initiative is inclusive and collaborative. It's about supporting locally led and voluntary efforts with ranchers and farmers and private landowners. It's about honoring tribal sovereignty. It's about access to the outdoors for all communities, no matter their income, background, or where they live. And it's about using science and traditional knowledge to guide how we conserve, connect, and restore the lands, waters, and wildlife upon which we all depend. It's exciting. The inclusive table that Green Latinos creates with partners and networks is a model of the collaborative conservation that America the Beautiful seeks to embrace. Thank you for being that model and for your continued support and collaboration as we work to bring this effort to communities across our nation. To match our efforts in conservation, Interior is making strides to create a clean energy economy to prevent further damage to our Earth. We also know that a clean energy transition will have important benefits for historically marginalized communities and advance our environmental justice and economic empowerment goals. Just last week, we announced the upcoming offshore wind energy lease sale for the New York Bight. Offshore wind development within the New York Bight could generate enough clean energy to power 2 million homes. We expect the sale could yield tens of thousands of good-paying jobs in the region. But this isn't just an exciting clean energy announcement. It's also an opportunity to advance several of our other goals. To that end, we're advancing several innovative lease stipulations and programs that will help be a model for other projects moving forward. We're requiring that lessees make every reasonable effort to enter project labor agreements to help ensure future projects in the Bight are built by union labor. We're also requiring lessees to identify tribes, underserved communities, and other ocean users who could be affected by offshore wind development. And we will hold companies accountable for improving their engagement, communication, and transparency with these communities. As we look forward, we know that we cannot ignore the pains of the past. The Biden-Harris administration understands that the disproportionate impacts from the pandemic and climate change stem from a long history of legacy pollution and marginalization. I come from a community in New Mexico that's still coping with the legacy of mining and the impact that those mines had on our water and our air. I've seen the health impacts that families deal with after years of neglect. Right now, millions of Americans live within a mile of tens of thousands of abandoned mines and orphaned oil and gas wells. These discarded remains of extractive industries spew poison into the air and nearby waters and contribute to climate change. I recently traveled to see some of these orphan wells, and more importantly, what is being done in communities to restore these areas. I met with a young activist who pointed out an idle site right outside the gates of a children's ballpark in a Spanish-speaking community. She told me how children go to school with tissues tucked in their noses because of the bleeds that they get so often from the toxicity in the air. And it's not a question of if she gets sick, but when. It's heartbreaking. But here is the good news. The new bipartisan infrastructure law includes $4.7 billion for orphan well site plugging, remediation, and restoration activities that will address longstanding risks of water contamination, seeping toxic chemicals, and destructive gas emissions that harm public health and wildlife. It's an important investment that we're working to get out into communities as quickly as possible because our children deserve better. This is something that Green Latinos has always had an eye toward, and something that Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Indigenous communities share. A moral responsibility to take care of the earth, not just for ourselves, but for future generations and for every living thing on this planet. It's clear in the way we respect the land. It's ingrained in the foods we eat, the traditions we keep, and the reverence we have for our earth. I want to thank all of you for bringing that history and that experience to the conversation and grounding this movement in equity. President Biden and the entire administration looks to be partners as we build a future that we can all embrace. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn the floor back to Angel. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Madam Secretary. I'm a father of three, and I first generation Mexican American and didn't get out often when I was a kiddo. But as a young parent, it's just so powerful for me and the kids to take a turn around a canyon, and we're learning and seeing the same thing for the first time. And so thank you for prioritizing our kiddos and equity as we power forward. Madam Secretary, I know you're super busy, and so I've only got two quick questions. We just had a conversation with Senator Ben Ray Lujan. He sends his hello, and a question for him was red or green, so I have to ask it.
Oh gosh, I don't want to disappoint anyone, but for me it's red.
Oh, Madam Secretary, that changes things. It changes things. No, just kidding. Red's delicious. Absolutely. And then last question. Before I pass it over to my colega, do you have any adventures or trips planned? What's your next adventure, I guess?
Well, I'll just say that I mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure law. That's super exciting. The opportunity for us to move that the funding into communities to plug those orphan wells and do that remediation work. I mean, look, that's something that we are going to lift up everywhere we can. So I'm looking forward to being out in those communities and making sure that we can put folks to work.
Well, thank you for that, Madam Secretary. We'd love to get you down to Castner Range National Monument proposal down in El Paso or Abicuame over out in Nevada. And so please always count us in for a good time. And thank you again for your time and your leadership, Madam Secretary. Truly.
Thank you so much, everyone.
And with that, I will pass it on over to my colega, Ms. Mariana, and thank you again, ma'am.